The headlines hit like sirens before dawn. A blinding red banner across the world's screens. President Trump threatens military action in Nigeria.
Trying to hide the tremor in their voices as they repeat the quote that has already ignited a global firestorm. If this continues, America will respond militarily. The words echo on loop, clipped, forceful, heavy with warning, no context, no diplomacy, just a threat that lands like a thunderclap. Chaos flickers across the broadcast, flames rising from shattered churches, families running barefoot through smoke-filled streets, pastors gripping crosses as though they weigh more than the world. The images are raw, real, impossible to ignore. Lives caught in the crossfire of faith and fear. Then, Trump again, his voice amplified, proud, unshaken. America will not stand by while Christians are slaughtered. The declaration is bold, wrapped in righteousness, aimed far beyond his borders. Supporters erupt online, typing prayers and praise with the urgency of people who believe history has finally found a champion willing to defend the persecuted. But outrage spreads just as fast. Critics warn of colonial echoes, a dangerous return to the idea that American power is a weapon blessed by divine purpose. Diplomats exchange frantic calls. World leaders try to decode whether Trump's threat is rhetoric or a real countdown to intervention. Even within his inner circle, unease grows. The State Department, caught off guard, scrambles to shape a narrative that doesn't lead to war in West Africa by morning. In Lagos, Abuja, and villages torn by conflict, fear twists into something more complicated. Is help finally coming, or is a new storm about to crash over them? Nigerian officials bristle at the suggestion that foreign soldiers could step onto their soil. Meanwhile, those who have buried their loved ones light candles and whisper that maybe finally, someone powerful is listening. Millions watch these events unfold like a movie they didn't buy tickets for, one with no heroes confirmed yet and no ending guaranteed. Hearts race. Tempers spark. Faith feels both shielded and threatened. And as the world holds its breath, one question surges louder than the headlines themselves. What could possibly have pushed a U.S. president to make such a dramatic threat, and why did even his closest allies fall silent? The camera pulls back from Trump's echoing words, revealing the ground they shake. Nigeria. Vast, vibrant, wounded. A country where faith has long been a heartbeat and a battlefield. Across its northern plains, smoke stains the horizon. Churches once filled with hymns now stand in silence, roofs collapsed, pews splintered, Bibles buried in ash. Villagers flee through tall grass carrying what little they can, a child, a crucifix, a memory. The violence is not random, it is ritualized fear. Neighbors divided by creed, survival dictated by which God one dares to claim. Every image feels biblical in scale. A mother kneels over a grave barely covered with earth. A priest, his white robe is streaked with dust as he blesses a convoy of refugees. Reporters describe it as sectarian conflict, but on the ground it feels simpler and crueler. People of faith being hunted for what they believe, while the world scrolls past their pain. In America, the story breaks through the noise of election chatter and celebrity headlines. Evangelical communities light up with outrage. Finally, some declare on talk shows, a president who won't bow to political correctness. Pastors quote scripture beside Trump's statement, calling it divine timing. He's standing for Christians when no one else will. One preacher says, voice trembling with conviction, hashtags like Fast Stand for Faith surge, layered over images of burning churches. In Washington's corridors, the tone is colder. Diplomats warn of dangerous precedent, of a world where tweets become threats and morality becomes muscle. Intelligence analysts whisper that the situation in Nigeria is more complex than a headline can hold. Aid workers plead for caution. A military response, one says, could light the region on fire, yet the moral current is unstoppable. Talk radio hosts frame it as a test of courage. Faith-based groups flood social media with prayers for Nigerian believers. Others ask an uncomfortable question: if America, the self-proclaimed protector of freedom, won't act when faith itself is attacked, then what is its moral worth? Meanwhile, Nigerian officials push back, accusing Western media of exaggeration, of turning tragedy into politics. But their denial only fuels suspicion. The silence of global institutions, the United Nations, the African Union, rings louder than any speech. In that vacuum, Trump's voice, however divisive, sounds like action. The world divides into two camps: those who see a savior defending the persecuted, and those who see a reckless man weaponizing faith. The moral line blurs under the heat of outrage. Is this leadership, or ego cloaked in sanctity? Is America defending the innocent, or projecting its own righteousness onto another nation's suffering? Commentators frame it as the new global question: can faith justify force? The debate spills from pulpits to parliaments, from living rooms to live streams. A single sentence from one man has cracked open the fault line between belief and power. And yet, beneath the noise, there's something deeper, a pattern. A familiar rhythm in Trump's defiance, The way he merges politics with divine duty, the way he speaks not just as a president but as a man on a mission. To understand the force behind those words, the conviction that makes allies flinch and supporters cheer, we have to look back, deep into his history of mixing faith, politics, and power. In Abuja, power hums like a secret language, spoken only by those who can afford to whisper it. Marble floors shine beneath the polished shoes of ministers who talk of reform by day and count oil revenues by night. The city glows with neon towers and imported champagne. A world away from the villages that burn in the country's north, convoys of tinted SUVs slice through the traffic, sirens clearing paths through crowds of the jobless. To outsiders, Nigeria's capital looks like progress. To those within, it feels like betrayal gilded in gold. Decades of promises had come and gone. We will rebuild. We will unite. We will protect every Nigerian. Presidents had declared beneath the green and white flag. Yet in the countryside, those words evaporated like breath on hot glass. Every election brought slogans of hope. Every victory birthed another silence. Beneath the surface of speeches and televised pledges, the same old currents of corruption flowed, quiet, relentless, unstoppable. In secret meetings, key politicians traded loyalty for contracts. Governors pocketed budgets meant for security forces. Weapons vanished before reaching those defending remote churches and villages. When foreign journalists pressed for answers, officials smiled thinly and blamed isolated incidents. A government spokesman, his wrist heavy with a gold watch, once said, "The West exaggerates these problems. Nigeria is not at war with itself." His voice dripped with practiced calm, but the footage behind him, smoke rising from a ruined chapel, told a different story. To the world, Nigeria remained a paradox. Africa's largest economy built on oil wealth and ambition, yet hollowed out by greed. The elite spoke of progress while entire regions drowned in neglect. In luxury hotels, power brokers clinked glasses, their laughter muffled by thick carpets and security gates. Just beyond those walls, families huddled in camps without clean water. A nurse working in one of those camps once murmured, "We'll count the living each morning before we count the dead." The corruption wasn't just financial, it was moral. It lived in the indifference of men who could end the killings but chose to debate them instead. In cabinet rooms perfumed with imported cigars, reports of massacres arrived folded inside folders no one wanted to open. Each tragedy was a statistic to be managed, not a life to be mourned. "Do you understand what this means for our image?" One minister snapped during a leaked meeting, waving a newspaper that detailed another village attack. Another replied with a smirk, "A mage's fade. Oil stays." The exchange became a ghost of the government's conscience, echoing through public outrage and social media storms. Global institutions tried to intervene, statements of concern, resolutions, aid packages, but their words drowned in bureaucracy. The United Nations released reports that landed like feathers in the wind. Western diplomats, wary of losing business ties, softened every criticism with polite caution. "We are monitoring the situation closely," they said again and again, as if observation itself could stop bloodshed. The true villain was not a single man, not a lone dictator to overthrow. It was a system of silence born of greed and hardened by pride, a network of men too powerful to feel, too secure to fear consequence. They had built walls of privilege so thick that even the cries of their people could not reach them. Within the chaos, the victims became invisible. Each attack blurred into the next. The names of the dead rarely made it past local headlines. Those who tried to speak out, journalists, priests, aid workers, found themselves threatened or worse, forgotten. The world moved on, feeding on newer tragedies while this one lingered like smoke. In the presidential palace, officials gathered around a televised report of Trump's warning. Their laughter was tight, brittle, rehearsed. "The Americans will do nothing." One scoffed. "They always talk." Another leaned back and said, "Let them tweet." Nigeria bows to no one, yet behind the bravado unease flickered. For the first time, the mirror of indifference reflected something different. Fear. Corruption had always been their armor, denial their shield. But Trump's words, reckless or righteous, pierced that illusion. The threat of exposure, of foreign pressure, of a moral reckoning loomed larger than they would admit. The palace corridors grew quiet after midnight, and the silence felt heavier than before. Because beneath the marble, beneath the luxury, beneath the lies, the truth was simple, and haunting power had abandoned its people. And as Nigeria's leaders turned away, one man thousands of miles away refused to stay silent before the world knew him as the man threatening military action in Nigeria. Donald Trump had already spent years casting himself as something larger than a president, a defender of a faith he believed was under siege. From podiums bathed in red, white, and blue light, he spoke to crowds who saw him not just as a politician but as a protector. "They want to take God out of everything," he'd say, his voice cutting through the roar of applause. "But not on my watch, not while I'm your president." It was always more than politics. It was theater, yes, but theater rooted in conviction. His rallies became revivals, a fusion of national pride and spiritual defiance. Supporters lifted hands, not just in salute but in belief. He was their champion against a world that mocked their values and their faith. To them, Trump wasn't merely speaking, he was standing. Long before the Nigeria controversy, he had made religion part of his identity. From the campaign trail to the Oval Office, he wove faith into his message like a thread of armor. "We will say Merry Christmas again," he declared one December night, smiling as the crowd erupted. It wasn't about the holiday. It was about reclaiming something sacred that his audience felt had been stolen. In the White House, aides watched how he spoke about Christianity, not as theology, but as symbol. In his mind, faith represented the moral backbone of civilization, and to attack it anywhere was to test the strength of freedom itself. When briefed on stories of persecuted believers abroad, from Egypt to Pakistan to Nigeria, he would lean forward, eyes narrowed. "Why isn't anyone doing something about this?" he'd ask. It wasn't rhetorical. It was challenge disguised as question. Those close to him often disagreed with his bluntness, his lack of caution. But even they couldn't deny the sincerity in those moments. He saw faith as a cornerstone, not fragile, not ornamental, but the foundation of the nation he led. And if that foundation was threatened anywhere in the world, it was, to him, an attack on the very idea of America. Flashbacks play like campaign footage burned into collective memory. Standing beneath a blazing sun in Iowa, a Bible raised in one hand, Trump at a church in Florida, surrounded by pastors who prayed over him, calling him a chosen defender. Trump in the Oval Office, head slightly bowed as an evangelical leader thanked him for restoring courage to the faithful. These were not accidents of imagery. They were the architecture of his persona, a man who believed that strength was a form of worship. Critics saw it differently, calling his faith performative, transactional, political. But to millions, that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was the first leader in years who spoke about God without apology, who didn't hide conviction behind diplomacy. Every time he declared America's duty to defend religious freedom, his base heard something deeper. Validation, belonging, power. He had built his political empire on defiance. Against elites, against global institutions, against moral ambiguity. And faith, to him, was the purest form of that defiance, an unyielding belief that light must not bow to darkness. When he spoke about Christians being killed in distant lands, his tone would harden. "It's wrong," he'd say. "It's evil. And it's going to stop." Advisors warned him that such statements could ignite diplomatic backlash. He would shrug, then let them be angry. He'd reply, "America should never be afraid to stand for what's right." That was Trump's creed. Unpolished, unfiltered, absolute. He didn't see nuance in matters of faith, he saw duty. Even his detractors admitted his instincts tapped into something raw and real, a deep hunger for moral clarity in an age of moral confusion. He gave voice to people who felt forgotten, mocked, or dismissed for believing in something higher, and when he said he'd defend Christians in Nigeria, Syria, or anywhere else, they believed him, not because he was infallible, but because he dared to sound certain. Inside the Oval Office, late at night, he would sometimes replay news clips on mute. Images of war zones, burned churches, displaced families. The silence of those pictures spoke louder than the commentary. "Look at them," he'd murmur. "Nobody helps them." In that solitude, stripped of cameras and applause, his faith became less a performance and more a purpose. He saw the world not as a chessboard of diplomacy, but as a battlefield of belief. Every moral crisis was an opportunity to prove America's soul hadn't gone soft, and every leader who ignored injustice became, in his mind, an accomplice. So when reports from Nigeria began to pour in, photos of churches turned to ash, families praying amid ruins, he didn't hesitate. To him, hesitation was weakness. Action was faith in motion. He believed that moral authority meant confrontation, not caution. And for a man who had built his life on boldness, the choice was instinctive. To stay silent was to betray everything he had promised his followers, and perhaps everything he believed about himself. So when Trump stood before the cameras and declared that America would not stand by while Christians were slaughtered, he wasn't just issuing a threat. He was fulfilling a vow he had made long before. To himself, to his supporters, and to the idea that faith, no matter how controversial, should never have to beg for protection. But when faith turns into policy, the world doesn't just listen, it reacts. The words had barely left Trump's lips before they detonated across the world. "If this continues, America will respond militarily." It was the kind of statement that didn't just ripple through headlines. It ruptured them. Within minutes, news alerts pinned across every screen. Within hours, it was the lead story in every major network's lineup. Cable anchors looked stunned, some exhilarated, others visibly alarmed. On Fox News, the tone was reverent. Finally, one commentator said, leaning forward in his chair. A president with the guts to defend Christians being slaughtered while the world stays silent. Across the split screen, an MSNBC host countered sharply, "This isn't defense. It's reckless saber rattling. You don't threaten a sovereign nation with military force over an internal conflict." The debate was instant and ferocious. Evangelical leaders in the U.S. hailed Trump as a modern-day protector of the faithful, drawing biblical parallels between his words and the call of ancient kings. "He's standing where others won't." One pastor declared in a viral clip, hashtags like FAIA stand for faith and Faith pray for Nigeria flooded social media, joined inevitably by others peg colonial Trump and America stay out faith not force. In Nigeria, the reaction was volcanic. Government spokesman called the statement an insult to national sovereignty. A senior Nigerian official accused the U.S. of hypocrisy, noting, "They talk about human rights, what they mean is control." Protesters gathered outside the American embassy in Abuja, waving banners that read, "Hands off Nigeria," and "We are not your battlefield." Inside diplomatic circles, the alarms blared quietly but urgently. Cables flew between Washington, London, and Brussels. Analysts debated whether Trump's words were mere bluster or a sign of something more ominous. A policy pivot that could destabilize an entire region. A leaked memo from a European diplomat captured the anxiety perfectly. "We are witnessing the reemergence of moral interventionism cloaked in religious language but carrying military consequences." Back in the U.S., the divide deepened. Conservative talk shows amplified the story as proof of Trump's strength, running montages of burning churches and sobbing survivors. "If defending Christians is wrong," one host declared, "then what does that say about us?" Meanwhile, liberal commentators accused him of exploiting tragedy for political theater. Editorial headlines read, "Faith weaponized. The gospel according to Trump." Social media turned into a battleground of its own. Clips of Trump's speech were remixed with dramatic music shared by millions. Others stitched in footage of drone strikes and protests, warning that defense of faith had too often been a pretext for violence. The moral question at the center of it all: was this courage or chaos? Split families, friends, even congregations. In church pews across America, pastors debated what it meant to defend the persecuted. Some urged prayer, others praised power. In one small-town congregation in Texas, a minister told his flock, "We've prayed for years for someone to stand up. Maybe, just maybe, this is that moment." Half his congregation nodded. The other half sat in uneasy silence. Meanwhile, global leaders scrambled to interpret the threat. The United Nations held an emergency session, its chambers thick with tension. Nigerian diplomats demanded an apology. The U.S. delegation stood firm. "Our president has spoken," one official said coldly. "We do not apologize for defending the innocent." Markets wavered. Oil prices ticked upward. Defense analysts began running simulations. What would an intervention in Nigeria even look like? What would it mean for Africa's balance of power? For U.S. relations with its allies? For the fragile illusion of moral diplomacy? Through it all, Trump remained silent after the initial outburst. A silence that amplified the uncertainty. Commentators speculated endlessly. Was this strategic pause or tactical restraint? Was he waiting for a reaction, or had he already decided what came next? Then, the Nigerian president broke his own silence in a fiery televised address. Standing before his nation's flag, he stared straight into the camera and said, "Nigeria bows to no foreign power. Not yesterday, not today, not tomorrow." His tone was icy, deliberate, and unmistakably defiant. The statement ignited a second firestorm. American news outlets called it a direct challenge. Nigerian newspapers called it a stand for sovereignty. Across social platforms, hashtags flipped overnight, from Faith pray for Nigeria to Faith defend Nigeria, and so the world found itself holding its breath. What began as a single sentence had become a global standoff of pride, faith, and fury. Diplomats warned of escalation. Churches called for peace. Pundits called for action. But underneath the noise, one question echoed louder than all the rest. Would Trump's warning stop the violence, or unleash something far worse? Then came the moment no one expected, a response that turned the threat into a standoff. The backlash hit hard and fast. Nigerian leaders denounced Trump's words as neo-colonial arrogance. The African Union condemned the threat as a dangerous echo of history. Even within the United Nations, whispers of imperialism in moral disguise rippled through the corridors. Cameras caught Nigerian protesters marching through Lagos streets, holding signs that read, "We are not your mission field." Cable pundits replayed those images side by side with Trump's face. The framing was deliberate, an old power clashing with a new independence. Critics spoke with venom, their voices trembling with disbelief. "It's moral hypocrisy," one European anchor said. "You cannot preach sovereignty at home and intervention abroad." But in Washington, the atmosphere was electric. It wasn't retreat, it was reload. The White House briefing room buzzed with tension. Reporters packed shoulder-to-shoulder, microphones aimed like bayonets. The air itself seemed to hum. The press secretary had been silent for days. Now the world waited for the man himself, and then he appeared. Trump stepped to the podium, chin raised, eyes hard, the signature red tie cutting through the flood of camera flashes. He didn't look like a man under siege. He looked like a man ready to make history, or war. The room erupted in shouts. "Mr. President, are you threatening a sovereign nation? As the U.S. preparing military action in Africa, do you realize the diplomatic fallout this has caused?" He raised one hand, and silence fell. When he spoke, his voice was lower, slower, deliberate. "Let me be clear," he began. "This is not about politics. This is about humanity. This is about people being hunted and murdered because of what they believe." The words hit like artillery. He didn't read from notes. He didn't flinch. His gaze stayed locked on the cameras. Knowing the entire world was watching, he continued, "If protecting the innocent is wrong, then America should never be right." The room froze. Pens stopped scratching. Every reporter looked up. Outside, in the press bullpen, the quote hit social media within seconds and exploded. "Then America should never be right" trended, instantly hijacked by both sides. Supporters hailed it as righteous defiance. Critics mocked it as self-contradiction, but no one ignored it. Trump leaned closer to the microphone. "For too long," he said, "the world has watched innocent men, women, and children slaughtered while politicians write letters and hold conferences. We've seen the photos, we've heard the cries, and we do nothing. That ends now." The statement wasn't policy. It was theater. Gospel and declaration rolled into one. In that moment, his voice wasn't just the president's. It was the voice of conviction itself. Raw, polarizing, unstoppable. Outside the White House gates, crowds began to gather. A swirl of flags, crosses, and protest signs. Some chanted, "Defend the faith." Others screamed, "Stay out of Africa!" The split was total. The moral fault line now visible in the streets of Washington. Inside conservative churches, the moment was played like prophecy fulfilled. "He's standing for us," one preacher thundered to a roaring congregation. "Showing that America's heart still beats for the faithful." Clips from sermons began trending, a digital echo chamber of passion, patriotism, and prayer. But across the ocean, the reaction was fury. Nigerian ministers called emergency sessions, accusing the U.S. of weaponizing compassion. A fiery speech in Abuja's parliament drew applause when a legislator shouted, "We will not be lectured by a nation drowning in its own hypocrisy." That soundbite became the counterpunch, broadcast worldwide. African commentators framed Trump's stance as modern moral colonialism. Editorials warned of a holy war of words, spiraling into something darker. And yet, despite the chaos, Trump's tone only hardened. In a follow-up rally days later, under glaring lights and thunderous chants of "USA! USA!" he doubled down. "You know, they say I shouldn't speak out," he told the crowd, voice rising above the roar. "They say it's not America's place, but when children are burned alive in churches, when people are killed for praying, what kind of country stays silent?" The audience roared. Flags waved. The camera panned across faces. Some crying, some shouting, all transfixed. Trump paused, eyes narrowing. "If standing up for faith makes me the villain, then so be it." And with that, he turned from the podium, music swelling behind him, the crowd erupting into thunder. The moment was pure cinematic release. The defiant hero walking offstage, the echo of conviction hanging in the air. The media replayed it endlessly. Clips circulated worldwide. Newsrooms dissected his tone, his phrasing, even the micro-expressions between his pauses. Was it strategy or sincerity? Was it belief or branding? But to his supporters, none of that mattered. To them, he had done what no leader before him dared. He had said the unsayable. He speaks truth, one woman told a reporter outside the rally, clutching a Bible to her chest. Even if the world hates him for it. Meanwhile, diplomats scrambled behind closed doors, drafting contingency plans in case Trump's rhetoric became reality. Intelligence briefings assessed the possibility of escalation. NATO allies whispered warnings. China issued a curt statement about respecting national sovereignty. The world was bracing for a conflict that hadn't even begun, and yet, amid all the chaos, the narrative began to split in two. In one version, Trump was the reckless showman lighting fires he couldn't control. In the other, he was the lone warrior standing against the tide, a symbol of faith unbent by fear. Social media captured both visions in cinematic detail. One viral video paired his "America should never be right" quote with haunting footage of burning villages and gospel choirs singing softly underneath. Another turned it into satire, a montage of missiles, megachurches, and moral contradictions. Both went viral. By now, the story had grown beyond Nigeria, beyond Washington. It had become a global Rorschach test. Every viewer saw what they wanted to see. Some saw strength, others saw danger, but no one could look away. Even his fiercest critics admitted privately he knew exactly what he was doing. The statement wasn't just a warning. It was a rebranding, a declaration that faith and foreign policy were no longer separate realms, but one and the same under his vision of American purpose. And in that realization lay the true mic drop. Not the words, but the transformation they signaled. Because when he said, "That ends now," he wasn't just talking about Nigeria. He was talking about the world order itself, a system that, in his eyes, had grown too timid, too afraid to act in defense of belief. The cameras caught one last shot as he left the stage, his silhouette framed against the American flag, the crowd's roar swelling into something that sounded less like applause and more like a vow. But as the dust settled, as headlines shifted and diplomats rushed to contain the fallout, something bigger began to unfold. Far beyond Washington or Abuja, the echo of Trump's words refused to fade. It ricocheted through timelines, talk shows and parliaments, a global tremor that blurred the line between sermon and threat. Within hours, the world became a battlefield of hashtags. Stand for Faith surged like wildfire across conservative circles, filled with images of crosses, folded hands, and glowing captions. Finally, a leader who won't bow. But right beside it, Try No to Intervention gathered its own momentum. Videos of Nigerian youth chanting in the streets, captions screaming, "Faith is no excuse for fire." On social media, the divide looked like two parallel worlds colliding in real time. One side saw salvation, the other domination. Between them, truth drowned in the noise. In the U.S., the Sunday sermons turned political. Pastors beamed Trump's speech across giant LED screens, congregations rising to their feet as the president's words echoed through stained glass. If protecting the innocent is wrong, then America should never be right. Applause thundered through sanctuaries from Texas to Tennessee. But in other pulpits, the tone was somber. A young pastor in Atlanta stood before his congregation, Bible in hand, and whispered, "If faith is used to justify fear, we have already lost the message." Across oceans, the world debated the morality of power in Rome. The Vatican released a careful statement calling for prayerful discernment before action. In London, protesters marched with banners reading, "No wars in God's name." And in Abuja, church bells rang, not in celebration but as a warning. Nigerian bishops begged both nations to choose mercy over might. The news cycle spun like a storm. On CNN, retired generals warned of military entanglement. On Fox, analysts hailed the return of moral clarity. Talk show hosts made it personal. Would you want your president to stay silent if it were your church, your family, your faith? Meanwhile, Nigerian communities in the U.S. became both rallying ground and refuge. In Houston, hundreds gathered at a candlelight vigil. Nigerian flags held high, gospel choirs singing through tears. A woman in traditional Ankara dress whispered to a reporter, "We don't need soldiers. We need safety." The clip went viral overnight, shared under the caption, "Faith Voices of Nigeria." But not all voices pleaded for peace. Some demanded action. "He's right," said an evangelical organizer in Ohio. "Evil doesn't listen to diplomacy, it listens to power." Within hours, a petition titled, "Protect the Persecuted," had gathered 500,000 signatures. American politicians fractured along familiar lines. Senators on the right praised Trump's moral courage. One declared on live television as not threatening war. He's threatening indifference. Across the aisle, others bristled. "We've seen this movie before," said a Democratic congresswoman. "It's every time America intervenes in the name of righteousness, innocent people pay the price." Late-night hosts turned it into cultural theater. One comedian opened his monologue with, "Breaking news. The president's declared holy war, film at 11. The audience laughed uneasily. Because beneath the punchlines, no one really knew how serious the situation had become. Then came the ripple effects, quiet but seismic. Defense analysts reported a surge in intelligence chatter around Africa's west coast. The Pentagon quietly increased satellite surveillance. Oil prices crept upward. Religious aid groups began mobilizing. Every move hinted that the line between moral rhetoric and military reality was thinning fast. Celebrities joined the fray. Some called for global compassion. Others posted cryptic patriotic clips. One megastar tweeted, "Sometimes faith needs fire." It sparked outrage and 1,000,000 retweets. The discourse mutated into spectacle. Hashtags turned into movements, movements into merchandise. T-shirts reading, "Faith over fear," sold out in hours. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, the impact was immediate and raw. The streets of Jos and Kaduna buzzed with anxiety. Some locals cheered Trump's words, hoping they'd bring attention to forgotten suffering. Others feared they'd invite chaos. "If America steps in," one teacher told the BBC, "the extremists will use that to recruit. We'll suffer twice." In Washington, advisors scrambled to contain the fallout. The State Department issued a carefully worded statement about exploring diplomatic solutions. But Trump's silence, that deliberate, camera-ready silence, hung over every briefing. It was as though he was letting the world sweat, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Cable networks played that silence on loop. Every pause, every unspoken implication became analysis fodder. Is this restraint, asked one anchor, or preparation? Then came the visual that froze the conversation in its tracks. Outside the UN headquarters in New York, two crowds gathered. On one side, American church groups waving crosses and singing hymns of courage. On the other, Nigerian activists chanting, "Hands off our home!" separated only by a line of NYPD officers. For a moment, the chants merged in rhythm, not harmony, but tension. The cameras caught it all: tears, fury, faith, and fear, all sharing the same street. And somewhere between those opposing chants, the question that had haunted every headline still lingered: what is America's role, savior or spectator? By now, even world leaders who had stayed silent began to speak. France urged diplomacy. China issued a veiled warning about foreign overreach. Russia stayed quiet, watching, waiting, calculating. The moral earthquake had become geopolitical. This was no longer just about Nigeria. It was about America's soul and how far it was willing to go in the name of faith. Talk shows turned philosophical. Can a nation be both moral and restrained? One host asked his guest. The expert smiled bitterly. It depends, he said, on who defines morality. By week's end, the story had shifted from breaking news to global reckoning. Universities hosted debates titled "The Theology of Power." Op-eds framed Trump as either prophet or provocateur, and yet, beneath the intellectual noise, ordinary people felt something deeper, a mix of pride, fear, and déjà vu, because once again America stood at the edge of a decision that could alter history. And just when the world thought the storm had passed, Trump's next move redefined everything. The noise began to fade. The hashtag slowed, the headlines softened, and what had once been a raging digital inferno settled into a quiet reckoning. The cameras had moved on to new crises, new controversies. But something lingered in the global conscience. For the first time in years, the world was talking not about politics, but about faith under fire. In villages across Nigeria, relief workers began to arrive. Journalists, aid groups, missionaries. The attention that had long been absent was suddenly unignorable. The world's spotlight, however fleeting, forced open the doors of indifference. Photos of rebuilt churches, reopened schools, and children singing hymns beneath patched roofs began circulating online. Finally, one Nigerian pastor said in a trembling voice, "They see us." Yet, beneath that gratitude, a question hung like smoke: at what cost? In Washington, Trump's statement became the subject of endless retrospection. His supporters called it divine timing. A man moved by faith, unafraid to confront evil. His critics called it dangerous theater, a president playing preacher, turning diplomacy into doctrine. But even they admitted one thing: he had made the world look. And maybe, in its own paradoxical way, that was the point. For decades, religious persecution had existed in the shadows of the global agenda, whispered about, rarely acted upon. It took a single, polarizing sentence to thrust it into the light. If protecting the innocent is wrong, then America should never be right. Whether one saw it as courage or chaos, the message forced humanity to ask itself what silence truly costs. In that reflection, something universal stirred. People began revisiting old debates, not about Trump, not about policy, but about morality itself. Can power ever be pure? Can faith ever be wielded without harm? Can nations defend belief without weaponizing it? One late-night commentator summed it up perfectly. For better or worse, he reminded us that morality isn't comfortable. It's disruptive. Around the world, small ripples of change began to appear. Governments quietly increased humanitarian funding to conflict zones. Church coalitions launched new outreach campaigns for persecuted minorities. Even critics of Trump's methods admitted that awareness had been reignited. A columnist wrote, "He said it like a hammer, but he hit a nerve the world could no longer ignore." In Nigeria, villagers lit candles at sunset, praying not for soldiers or sanctions, but for peace. In Washington, activists met in candlelight vigils of their own, divided by politics but united in reflection. Across continents, the noise turned into whispers, the anger into contemplation. Trump, as always, remained defiant. At a rally weeks later, he looked out over his crowd and said, "I don't regret it. Sometimes the truth has to shout." The audience roared, but the world beyond them listened in silence, each person deciding for themselves whether that shout was justice or pride. In the end, the controversy had become something larger than the man himself. It wasn't about Trump versus Nigeria anymore. It was about the eternal tug-of-war between conviction and restraint, between the courage to act and the wisdom to pause. Because history has always been written in moments like these, when the line between righteousness and recklessness blurs, and the world must decide which side of that line it stands on. As one Nigerian journalist wrote, watching the story unfold from Lagos, "He forced the powerful to remember the powerless. Even if he did it the wrong way, he did not let them look away." And perhaps that was the true moral hidden inside the chaos. that sometimes the messenger and the message are separate things, that even flawed conviction can awaken dormant conscience. The world may never agree on whether Trump's threat was heroism or hubris, but it left an imprint, a scar, perhaps, that would remind leaders everywhere that faith, once spoken aloud from the seat of power, can move nations or shake them apart. When leaders defend belief, the world listens. But when they act without balance, the world trembles, and as history will judge this moment, one question remains: did Trump ignite change, or merely light a fuse? The story began with a threat, one man's voice echoing across continents. If this continues, America will respond militarily. It was a line that split the world in two, between faith and fear, conviction and consequence. And now, as the dust settles, we're left with a question that refuses to fade. Was Trump's warning a defense of faith or the first step toward danger? For some, he was the protector of the persecuted, a leader unafraid to call out evil when the world stayed silent. For others, he was the provocateur, wielding belief like a weapon, lighting fires in the name of righteousness. Both can't be true, and yet maybe both are, because in every era, leadership demands a choice to stay silent and safe, or to speak truth and risk the storm. Trump chose the latter, and in doing so, forced a reckoning far beyond politics. Whether you admire his courage or question his methods, one fact remains: he made the world look, think, and feel. And that's what this moment will be remembered for, not just the controversy, but the confrontation with conscience it unleashed. So as the screen fades, as the noise quiets and the heartbeat of history slows, ask yourself, what would you do when faith and fear collide? Would you whisper, or would you speak? Because truth, no matter how uncomfortable, only lives when voices refuse to be silenced. If you believe truth must still be spoken, subscribe, share, and stand for what you believe in. The flag waves, the music fades, the heartbeat stops, and in that silence, the question still lingers: did he ignite change or merely light a fuse?